We are taking a deep dive into some pretty intense philosophical territory with a book that really flips the script, The Antichrist
Mm.
by Friedrich Nietzsche. And just to be clear, this isn't some religious fire and brimstone thing. This is a philosopher really dissecting and challenging some of our most basic assumptions.
Yeah, it's like a crash course in a worldview that has shaken up centuries of thinking. Nietzsche doesn't just disagree, he offers a whole new way of looking at morality, truth, power, the whole 9 yards,
Mhm.
and especially religion.
So Nietzsche just dives right in with some pretty strong definitions, and they're kind of unexpected. He says, good is basically anything that makes you feel more powerful, more capable,
Mm-hmm.
and evil.
Mm-hmm.
That springs from weakness, a sense of being overwhelmed. Even happiness, he says, isn't just contentment. It's more like that rush you get from growing, from overcoming something. And this all comes back to this idea he calls the will to power. Can you break down that concept for us?
Well, the interesting thing here is that Nietzsche isn't necessarily talking about power in the typical, political sense. Think of it more as this essential life force, an inherent drive within everything that lives to expand, to grow, to assert itself.
Oh,
So when he says good is tied to augmenting power, he means anything that fuels that drive, that makes you feel more alive, more effective. And the flip side, evil, comes from whatever hinders that drive, makes you feel diminished or weakened. Happiness, in this framework, is a feeling you get when you experience this increase in vitality and strength.
got it. So it's not so much about being nice in the traditional sense, but more about cultivating this inner strength and growth,
Right.
which leads us to his idea of the higher type of person.
Mm.
He contrasts this with what he calls the herd animal. And he really associates that herd mentality with Christianity.
Mm.
Sounds like he wasn't a fan of just going along with the crowd for the sake of it.
No.
So who is this higher type in Nietzsche's mind?
So the higher type embodies this will to power, someone who's self-reliant, forging their own values, not just blindly following the herd. They aren't afraid of challenges. In fact, they see obstacles as opportunities to become even stronger.
Okay.
The herd animal, on the other hand, is more about seeking safety in numbers, clinging to conventional morality, and fearing anything that's different. Nietzsche felt that Christianity, with its emphasis on humility and conforming, really cultivated this herd mentality.
And here's where things get really interesting because he's not buying into this idea of inevitable progress that we often hear about.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, he looks back at the Europeans of the Renaissance period with more admiration than people of his own time. So this whole notion that we're always moving towards some better future, he saw that as a modern delusion. What did he see in the Renaissance that he found so appealing?
Well, Nietzsche admired the Renaissance because he saw it as this period where people were more assertive, more creative, more willing to take risks and just embrace life in all its messy glory without being so bound by the moral restrictions that became dominant later on. He saw a certain vibrancy and strength in that era that he felt was being lost in his time, with the rise of what he saw as a kind of mass society and, in his view, a weakening of the individual will.
Okay, so now let's get to the heart of his problem with Christianity.
Hmm.
He argues that it's waged a war against this higher type by basically flipping natural instincts on their head. He believes it sides with the weak and even makes an ideal out of opposing our instinct for self-preservation. That's a pretty fundamental clash with a lot of traditional values.
Yeah. Absolutely. Nietzsche believed that Christian morality, with all its emphasis on compassion, forgiveness, self-sacrifice, was actually undermining the qualities he valued: strength, independence, self-affirmation.
Oh, I see.
He saw it as a slave morality that came from the resentment of people who felt weak, oppressed, and then created a system of values that praised those weaknesses and condemned the strength of those who had power over them.
And he had some strong opinions about pity. He called it a depressant, something that weakens us through its natural selection by, well, keeping the botched around.
Yeah.
He even labeled pity as a technique of nihilism. Sounds pretty harsh, doesn't it?
Well, it's definitely a challenging viewpoint.
Yeah.
Nietzsche saw pity as getting in the way of the natural processes that lead to growth and improvement. He felt it could be a way of avoiding our own pain and struggles by focusing on the suffering of others. And when he calls it a technique of nihilism, what he means is that by constantly dwelling on and preserving weakness, pity ultimately devalues life itself. It's a tough perspective to swallow, for sure, as it goes against a lot of deeply ingrained humanitarian instincts.
Yeah. He was also pretty scathing about theologians, seeing their theological instinct as basically dishonest and opposed to truth. He even went as far as saying whatever a theologian regards as true is probably false. Now, that's a pretty sweeping statement. What's the thinking behind that?
Well, Nietzsche felt that theologians start with a fixed set of beliefs, often rooted in faith and dogma, and then they sort of twist the world to fit those beliefs instead of engaging in a genuine, objective search for truth. He saw it as a kind of intellectual dishonesty, putting belief above evidence and reason.
Okay, so let's talk about his take on God, which is pretty radical. He thought the very concept of God had been corrupted. It started out, in his view, as a reflection of a nation's power, but then devolved into this God of the weak. He even suggests that the idea of a good God only pops up when there's a decline in this will to power we've been talking about. How does he explain that shift?
Well, Nietzsche argued that in earlier, more vibrant societies, the gods often represented strength, power, even a certain ruthlessness.
Right.
But as societies weakened and that slave morality took hold, the idea of God changed to reflect the values of the weak: compassion, mercy, forgiveness. This good God, in his view, becomes a projection of the longings of those who lack power in the real world.
It's interesting that he brings Buddhism into this discussion and actually views it in a more favorable light than Christianity.
Yeah.
He felt it was more honest and objective, focusing on suffering rather than sin, stemming from different psychological conditions. What made him see Buddhism more positively?
Well, Nietzsche saw Buddhism as more grounded in a practical understanding of suffering and the path to overcome it through self-discipline and awareness, without all the moral judgments and supernatural baggage that he associated with Christianity. He felt that its roots in a different cultural and psychological landscape meant it was perhaps more upfront about the realities of human existence.
He also argued that Christian morality and religion just aren't rooted in reality, that they're built on these imaginary notions like God, soul, sin, salvation. Basically, he dismissed them as fiction.
Right.
Can you elaborate on that a bit?
So for Nietzsche, Christianity exists in this constructed world of supernatural beliefs that don't actually have any basis in the natural world.
Right.
He saw these ideas as distractions from the realities of human existence and, even as tools used to control people through guilt and promises of rewards in the afterlife. He then goes into the history of Israel, seeing it as this attempt to erase natural values, which led, in his view, to a distorted idea of God and morality.
What did he see as problematic in that historical development?
Nietzsche viewed the rise of monotheism in ancient Israel, with its emphasis on a single, all-powerful God and a rigid moral code, as a turning point where a more naturalistic worldview that affirmed life was replaced by a system of rules and prohibitions that he felt degraded natural instincts and values.
And his interpretation of Jesus is pretty surprising, too. He saw Jesus as more of a symbolist, someone who rejected the ideas of guilt, punishment, and reward. He felt Jesus' message was about a way of life, not establishing a new faith. And then he could contrast this with the development of the church and what he calls Pauline Christianity, which he saw as a complete distortion. He even calls Paul a genius for hatred. Pretty strong words.
Yeah, very strong. Nietzsche saw Jesus as embodying a radical form of self-overcoming, a rejection of conventional societal values. He felt that Jesus' message was about inner transformation and how to live in the present moment. But he then saw Paul as completely misinterpreting and distorting that message, turning it into this rigid, dogmatic religion obsessed with sin, salvation, and resentment. And Nietzsche believed this was all driven by Paul's own will to power.
So then he brings up this idea of the transvaluation of all values and talks about free spirits being at war with traditional notions of truth and falsehood. What does this transvaluation actually involve?
Well, in essence, Nietzsche believed that the dominant value system, which he saw as being heavily shaped by Christian morality, needed to be completely reevaluated and overthrown. This transvaluation means creating new values that celebrate life, strength, creativity, rather than clinging to values of weakness and self-denial that he associated with Christianity.
Oh, I see.
And free spirits are those individuals who have the courage to question and challenge the prevailing values and create their own path.
He really takes aim at those classic Christian virtues of faith, hope, and charity, calling them Christian ingenuities, and seeing faith as a sign of a weak will, even a lie.
Right.
Why such a harsh assessment?
Nietzsche viewed these virtues not as true strengths, but as coping mechanisms for the weak, to deal with their limitations and even assert a kind of moral superiority over the strong. He saw faith as a refusal to face reality, a reliance on comforting illusions. He saw hope as putting off life for some future reward, and charity as potentially enabling weakness instead of promoting strength.
He goes so far as to call the church a Catholic lunatic asylum and says Christian values are basically noble values turned upside down. Doesn't get much more blunt than that.
No, it doesn't. Nietzsche felt that the church was a system built on irrational beliefs that actively hindered human potential. He believed that Christian morality had twisted natural, healthy instincts into something harmful, praising weakness and condemning strength.
And he concludes his critique by calling Christianity the one great curse, this force of corruption, revenge, and the one immortal blemish upon the human race.
Yeah.
That leaves very little room for interpretation.
It's a powerful and provocative statement, that's for sure. And it really sums up his deep conviction that Christianity has been this incredibly damaging force in Western civilization, holding back human flourishing and promoting a philosophy that denies life.
So, zooming out a bit and looking at the bigger picture here, what are the implications of all this for how we understand morality, truth, power, and religion? He really throws a curveball into the mix, grounding morality and power not in divine laws or some innate sense of good.
Exactly. Nietzsche challenges that traditional idea that morality is based on some objective truths given to us from a higher power.
Hmm.
Instead, he suggests that moral systems are creations of humans, reflecting power dynamics and serving specific agendas. His idea that good is what increases power means that values are ultimately linked to what helps an individual or group thrive and become stronger.
And his take on truth is just as challenging. He sees it as something easily influenced by our desire to believe and these ingrained theological habits, rather than some pure, objective thing just waiting to be discovered.
Nietzsche was deeply skeptical of the idea of objective truth, especially in areas like religion and morality. He argued that our beliefs are often shaped more by our psychological needs, our emotions, our yearning for certainty, than by a neutral pursuit of facts. He even saw this will to truth as a form of the will to power, a drive to impose our own interpretations on the world.
And he puts power right at the center of it all, as this driving force, analyzing how different sets of values either embrace it or try to suppress it.
Right. For Nietzsche, power, and I mean that in the broadest sense, not just political control, but also personal strength, creativity, the will to overcome is fundamental to life itself. He viewed different value systems as either encouraging and celebrating this power or as arising from weakness and trying to limit the power of others. His analysis encourages us to really look at the power dynamics at play and how our beliefs are formed and maintained.
And finally, his critique of religion, and specifically Christianity, paints it as this force in history that has actually weakened humanity by inverting natural values and promoting weakness.
He believed that Christianity marked a big shift in Western thought, away from a worldview that affirmed life and was more oriented towards power, towards one that he saw as denying life and fixated on weakness. He felt that this has had lasting negative effects on Western culture, stifling human potential and fostering resentment and nihilism.
So, to sum it all up, Nietzsche's The Antichrist offers a stark and provocative perspective on morality, truth, power, and religion. It's about as far from conventional wisdom as you can get.
Exactly. And this deep dive is really just a starting point for you to think about these essential ideas from a radically different viewpoint. Nietzsche forces us to question the very basis of our beliefs and consider how historical and psychological forces have shaped what we consider true and good.
And on that note, here's a question to ponder. Nietzsche said that the embrace of the Christian God by the strong Northern European peoples was a symptom of their underlying weakness. What might be the long-term effects on societies that adopt value systems that, according to Nietzsche, actually undermine their vitality and strength? It's a pretty heavy thought to wrestle with as you continue to explore these enduring questions. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.